On a quiet afternoon in a bustling neighborhood, Andre Pulliam was gunned down in broad daylight at a local car wash. Known for his unwavering commitment to the youth of his community, Andre had spent his life offering guidance, hope, and support to countless young people. He was a figure of stability in a world that often seemed uncertain. Yet on that fateful day, his life was violently cut short, leaving behind a shattered family, a grieving community, and an unsettling question. Why would someone target Andre Pulliam? Initial reports claimed that the shooting was a random act of violence, a senseless tragedy in an already troubled area. But as detectives began to dig deeper, the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit the way they were supposed to. Surveillance footage, ballistics evidence, and a series of clues led to a shocking revelation. This was no random shooting. The careful precision of the murder and the circumstantial evidence suggested a deeper, more calculated motive behind Andre's death. A black SUV had circled the block twice before the shot rang out. The shooter had used a specialized firearm, firing from a moving vehicle, an act that required a level of preparation and intent. Investigators soon learned that the parts used in the weapon could be traced to an online seller, and this trail would lead them to a familiar name in the world of gangs. But the road to uncovering the full truth was just beginning, and with every new revelation, the mystery grew darker. Stay with us as we delve into the case that has left more questions than answers, the investigation that uncovered a chilling connection, and the unexpected twists that would change everything. Andre Pulliam was a beloved figure in his community. For years, he had dedicated himself to working with at-risk youth, offering guidance and mentorship to those who needed it most. His passion for helping young people wasn't just a job, it was his life's mission. He was more than just a counselor. He was a confidant, a protector, and a beacon of hope in a neighborhood where both seemed in short supply. As the youth counselor at the local community center, Andre's reach extended far beyond his office. He spent countless hours volunteering, organizing events, and simply being present for the children and families who relied on him. His name became synonymous with trust and support. To those who knew him, Andre was the embodiment of selflessness, someone who always put others before himself, especially the young people he mentored. But behind his role as a counselor, Andre was a family man. His relatives describe him as someone who always made time for family, no matter how busy his days were. His presence was a constant source of comfort to those closest to him. His life was marked by a deep sense of responsibility, not just to his community, but to his loved ones. So, when news of his death spread, it wasn't just his colleagues or friends who felt the loss. It was his entire family, who could not fathom why anyone would want to harm Andre. At first, his family believed the worst had been a tragic case of random violence, a senseless attack in a neighborhood that had seen its fair share of hardship. But as the investigation unfolded, the possibility of a random shooting began to unravel. What had initially seemed like a random act of violence was quickly revealing itself as something much more calculated. To stay updated on the investigation and uncover the chilling truth behind Andre's murder, subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. This case is far from simple, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what really happened that day. Andre Pulliam's death was a blow that reverberated far beyond the walls of his community center. For those closest to him, his family, friends, and the young people he mentored. The loss felt personal, as though a vital part of their world had been ripped away without warning. His family described him as a rock, someone who was always there, no matter the circumstances. He was the type of person who would drop everything to lend a helping hand, whether it was helping a cousin with a school project or guiding a troubled teen through a difficult moment. His mother, in particular, spoke of Andre with a deep sense of pride and admiration, calling him the family's heart. He wasn't just her son. He was her protector, her source of joy, and her unwavering support in times of need. His sudden death left a void that felt impossible to fill, and the grief was only compounded by the fact that no one could understand why this happened to him. In the community, Andre was known as much for his ability to connect with others as for his professional role. He had a unique talent for seeing the potential in young people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. To many, he wasn't just a counselor. He was a mentor and a friend who guided them through life's challenges. His relationship with the young people he worked with was built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared sense of hope for a brighter future. But Andre's relationships weren't limited to the youth he helped. His bond with his colleagues was equally profound. Many saw him as a leader not just because of his position, but because of the way he led by example. Andre didn't shy away from difficult conversations or uncomfortable truths. He had a way of inspiring others to be better, to push past their limits, and to stay grounded in their values. His influence extended throughout the entire neighborhood, and to those who worked alongside him, Andre was a steady, dependable force in their lives. However, as with any close-knit community, there were complications. Though Andre had a vast network of friends and supporters, there were always undercurrents of tension, especially in areas where resources were scarce and competition for attention was fierce. Some people resented the attention Andre received, believing he overshadowed others with his presence and success. In such environments, it was inevitable that jealousy, rivalry, and even suspicion would arise. While most of these tensions remained beneath the surface, Andre's murder began to surface deeper questions about his connections, some that no one had ever considered before. His family, especially his mother, struggled to comprehend how someone so selfless, so dedicated to the betterment of others, could become a target. They initially held on to the belief that Andre's death was random, a senseless tragedy that could happen to anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as the investigation began to unfold, more complex and troubling details emerged. His family's doubts about the randomness of the shooting grew, but they had no answers, only a growing sense of unease. Meanwhile, the community's response was a mixture of disbelief and anger. People had come to depend on Andre for so many things: advice, guidance, and a sense of stability in a world that often felt chaotic. The sense of betrayal was palpable. The idea that someone could target him, someone who had given so much to the community, was almost too much to bear. It raised questions that no one had answers to, least of all the people who had been closest to him. With the case still unresolved, Andre's loved ones were left to grapple with the mystery of his death. For his family, the need for answers was urgent. They wanted justice, not just for the loss of Andre, but to ensure that his death would not be in vain. But the investigation would soon reveal that the case was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The day of Andrei Pulliam's death began like any other. It was a warm afternoon, and the car wash on the corner of the street, where Andrei had been working, was bustling with activity. He was known for his routine, handling business during the day, and then spending evenings with his family or at community events. It was precisely this sense of predictability that made his murder so unsettling. The attack seemed random, but the investigation into Andrei's death would soon uncover troubling signs that pointed to something far more deliberate. The first sign that this wasn't a random act came from the surveillance footage. The security cameras around the car wash had captured a black SUV looping the block twice before the fatal shot rang out. To the casual observer, it may have seemed insignificant, but for investigators, this unusual behavior stood out. The vehicle wasn't simply passing through the area, it was deliberately circling, as if scouting the location, preparing for the right moment to strike. At first, family members and witnesses held onto the belief that Andrei's death was just another instance of violence in a neighborhood that had seen its share of hardship. They tried to make sense of the tragedy in a way that offered them some comfort, a random act of senseless violence. But as detectives began to dig into the details, the story started to unravel. The surveillance footage suggested a level of premeditation, as if the shooter had been familiar with Andrei's routine. They could have shot him during any of his usual shifts, but the decision to wait and take multiple passes through the block hinted at a more intentional plan. In addition to the footage, the ballistic evidence also began to raise red flags. Andrei had been shot with a high-powered weapon, one that had been modified with a stabilized brace, allowing for more accurate shooting from a moving vehicle. This detail, while seemingly technical, was an important clue. It suggested that the shooter had experience with firearms and that the attack had been carefully executed. The precision of the shot, coming from a moving car, pointed to a level of expertise that made the case stand apart from other acts of violence in the area. This wasn't the act of a random criminal. This was the work of someone with a specific goal in mind. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they discovered a troubling connection to the online marketplace for firearm parts. Aftermarket parts were traced back to an online seller, and through their investigation, the buyer of these parts was identified as a known gang affiliate. This was a crucial lead. It was clear now that Andrei's murder wasn't a random crime. It was tied to something much bigger. The gang connection added a layer of complexity that no one had initially expected. Was Andrei caught in the crossfire of a gang dispute, or was his death part of a more calculated plan? Further compounding the suspicion was the discovery of GPS data from the suspect's phone, which placed him within meters of the car wash at the time of the shooting. This was the evidence that sealed the timeline. The suspect had not only been in the vicinity, but his phone's location logs confirmed his proximity to the scene when Andrei was killed. The picture was becoming clearer. Someone had gone to great lengths to track Andrei's movements, plan the attack, and execute it with chilling precision. The early warning signs had been there all along, subtle clues that, when put together, painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated murder. But for those closest to Andrei, the shift from viewing the death as a random act of violence to a premeditated crime was difficult to accept. The realization that Andrei may have been targeted sent shockwaves through his family and the community. What had seemed like a tragic accident now appeared to be part of a much darker narrative. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the full story was still far from clear. As the investigation deepened, the case of Andre Pulliam's murder began to take on a far more complex and chilling dimension. What had initially been viewed as a senseless killing, an unfortunate byproduct of the violence that plagued the neighborhood, was quickly becoming a deliberate and calculated crime. The more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that this was no random act of violence. The ballistics evidence was the first major clue. Andre had been shot from a moving vehicle, a significant detail that couldn't be ignored. The weapon used was not a typical handgun. It had been modified with a stabilizing brace, a device that helped control the recoil of the firearm, allowing the shooter to maintain accuracy while firing from a vehicle in motion. This level of precision indicated that the person behind the shooting was no amateur. Whoever had carried out the murder was experienced and had a clear understanding of how to execute such a crime. In addition to the stabilizing brace, forensic evidence suggested that the shooter had used a high-powered rifle, capable of delivering a deadly shot at long range. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a planned execution. The methodical nature of the crime stood in stark contrast to the family's initial belief that Andre had been the victim of a random act of violence. The shooter had waited, carefully positioning themselves for the perfect shot. The surveillance footage, now fully examined, provided even more startling revelations. The black SUV had been seen circling the block twice before the fatal shot was fired. At first, the authorities had assumed this was just an inconsequential detail, but upon closer inspection, it became apparent that the SUV's movements were deliberate. It wasn't a random passerby. The vehicle had been scouting the area, making sure Andre was in the right position at the right time. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was cold, calculated, and planned with eerie precision. With these pieces of evidence in hand, detectives turned their attention to the next lead, the firearm itself. The stabilizing brace used in the crime had been purchased online through a marketplace that specialized in aftermarket gun parts. After painstaking investigation, they were able to trace the parts to a seller, who, after further questioning, provided the name of the buyer. The buyer was no stranger to law enforcement. He was a known gang affiliate with a history of violent crime and illegal weapons possession. This was the breakthrough the investigators had been waiting for. As detectives delved into the background of the suspect, they uncovered a series of connections that were both disturbing and revealing. The gang ties were undeniable. The suspect was not only linked to a notorious local gang, but had also been involved in several incidents of violence, many of which had been swept under the rug by a justice system overwhelmed by the scale of the gang problem. The deeper the investigators dug, the more it became apparent that Andre's murder was no isolated incident. It was part of a much larger web of violence, one that stretched far beyond the neighborhood and into the heart of the criminal underworld. The critical turning point came when GPS data from the suspect's phone placed him in close proximity to the car wash at the time of the shooting. This was the final piece of evidence that tied the suspect directly to the crime. The phone logs, which had been carefully analyzed, showed that the suspect's phone had been within meters of the crime scene just moments before the shooting. The phone had pinged off nearby cell towers, confirming that the suspect had been in the area at exactly the right time. This connection solidified the timeline and made it impossible for the suspect to deny his involvement. At this point, the investigation had moved beyond simple questions of motive. The gang connection was clear, and it seemed that Andre's murder had been orchestrated with the aim of sending a message. The details of the case were slowly falling into place, and the scope of the crime was beginning to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. Andre Pulliam, a beloved counselor dedicated to the youth of his community, had been caught in the crossfire of a gang-related feud, an unintended casualty in a larger battle over power, control, and territory. Yet, even with the evidence mounting, the question of why Andre had been targeted remained unanswered. What role had he played in this web of violence? Was he a victim of mistaken identity, or had he been deliberately singled out for reasons that no one yet understood? These questions would remain at the forefront of the investigation as detectives worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the plot behind Andre's tragic death. The aftermath of the fire was a chaotic and heart-wrenching scene. As fire engines and police vehicles lined the street, the full scope of the devastation became evident. Neighbors gathered outside, eyes wide with disbelief as they watched the firefighters work tirelessly to contain the flames. Inside the building, Rico Summers' life had been violently extinguished, and the scene was one of utter destruction. Yet, even amidst the physical ruin, the emotional toll was palpable, especially for those who had known him best. For Rico's family, the news of his death was a devastating shock. His parents, who had never expected their son to be caught in a situation so tragic, were left grappling with confusion and grief. They could hardly believe that their quiet, introverted son, who had kept to himself for so long, had become the target of such an intense, deliberate act of violence. In the days following the fire, they struggled to make sense of the loss, piecing together the story of a man who had kept so much of his pain hidden from them. They hadn't known the full extent of the tension between Rico and his former roommate. They hadn't known the depth of his fear, nor had they fully understood the danger he had been living in. For friends and coworkers, the shock was just as profound. Rico had been a reserved person, but those who knew him well described him as kind-hearted and dependable. His colleagues at work expressed disbelief that someone so seemingly harmless had been the victim of such a brutal crime. They recalled small things, like his tendency to keep to himself or the occasional mention of difficulties with his living situation. But none of these clues seemed to add up to the tragedy that would eventually unfold. Those who had spent time with him began to wonder if they had missed warning signs, signs that might have helped them intervene or offer support. But hindsight, as they say, is always clearer than the present. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, there was a sense of unease in the neighborhood. People whispered in hushed tones, sharing what little they knew of Rico's life and trying to make sense of his violent end. It was clear to many that this wasn't the result of a random tragedy, but a personal attack. But who could have done this? And why? The unanswered questions only amplified the growing tension in the community. The police investigation began promptly, but the scene was not an easy one to navigate. The fire, though largely contained, had destroyed much of the physical evidence. What remained of the apartment was little more than a charred shell, and the signs of forced entry into the apartment were all that stood out in the aftermath. Forensics teams worked meticulously, sifting through the rubble to uncover any clues that might point to the cause of the fire and the identity of the perpetrator. As the investigation continued, the emotional responses from those close to Rico only deepened. Family members were left to deal with not just their grief, but also the uncertainty of the circumstances surrounding his death. They were determined to know what had happened to him, yet the more they learned, the more horrifying the reality became. Rico's attempt to protect himself, his decision to file a restraining order, seemed to have set off a tragic chain of events. What had started as a call for help had escalated into something far more lethal. For the police, the immediate challenge was to connect the dots between the evidence they had, primarily the forced entry and the odd nature of the fire, and the growing suspicion of foul play. The forced entry into the apartment suggested that Rico had been the victim of a targeted attack, not a random break-in. But who would have wanted to harm him so violently? The answer, though not yet clear, was beginning to take shape. As the investigators turned their attention to the people closest to Rico, they began to unravel the details of the relationship with his former roommate, a connection that would soon prove to be the key to solving the case. The community, still reeling from the shock, began to question how something so horrific could have happened in their own neighborhood. They were left to wonder whether the quiet man who lived among them had been hiding the depths of his fear from them all along. Could anyone have known what was happening behind closed doors? Or was Rico simply another victim of a world that can sometimes be far darker than we can imagine? In the days following the fire, investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind Rico Summers' death. What had seemed like a tragic, yet random accident was slowly beginning to reveal itself as something far more sinister. With every piece of evidence they uncovered, the reality of what had happened to Rico became clearer and more chilling. The first crucial breakthrough came in the form of forensic analysis. Fire marshals, having initially suspected an electrical fault, quickly shifted their focus when the pattern of the blaze was revealed to be anything but accidental. Experts determined that the fire had been set using a dual ignition accelerant pattern, an intentional act designed to mimic the effect of a faulty electrical system. This was no random blaze. It had been strategically staged to confuse investigators and conceal the true cause of death. The accelerant used was a chemical compound that burned with a distinct and unusual signature. It wasn't long before investigators sent a sample of the residue found at the scene to a specialized lab. The results were eye-opening. The chemical signature of the accelerant matched one that could be traced back to a specific source. It was a common industrial substance, available to those with knowledge of its properties, and it suggested a level of premeditation that was difficult to ignore. The idea that this had been an accident was now impossible to defend. The next piece of the puzzle came from the analysis of the physical evidence at the scene. Forensic investigators carefully examined the doorframe, and what they found left little doubt that this was not a burglary gone wrong. Tool marks on the doorframe indicated forced entry, but crucially, the marks suggested that the entry had occurred after Rico was already unconscious. This revealed that Rico had not been awake when the fire started. The fire had been set while he was incapacitated, which meant that the person responsible had ensured he was subdued before taking the deadly step of igniting the blaze. This detail was pivotal. It suggested that this was not a crime of opportunity, but a crime of intent. As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that the forced entry was a calculated part of the crime scene. The perpetrator had entered the apartment after Rico had already been knocked unconscious, further supporting the theory that this was a targeted attack. The fire, which had initially been thought to be the focal point of the crime, was now revealed to be a means of covering up the true nature of what had happened. The murderer had made sure to manipulate the scene in a way that would mislead anyone looking into the case. It was around this time that the police began to piece together the connection between Rico and his former roommate. Initially, the roommate had seemed like a distant figure in the investigation, someone who was unlikely to have played a role in such a heinous act. However, as detectives looked into the details of their relationship, a more disturbing picture began to emerge. The former roommate had a history, one that was hidden beneath layers of manipulation and deceit. Rico's decision to file the restraining order, which had seemed like a simple legal maneuver to protect himself, now took on a darker significance. The restraining order had been the catalyst for the violence, a line in the sand that Rico's former roommate could not tolerate. The emotional instability and mounting anger of the former roommate, combined with the intense need to regain control, had led to the tragic events that would unfold on the night of the fire. The final key to the investigation came when a trace analysis of soot found on the suspect's clothing revealed a startling match with the chemical signature of the accelerant used in the fire. This discovery was the smoking gun. The evidence was irrefutable. The former roommate had been directly involved in the crime. The soot analysis indicated that the suspect had been close to the fire when it was set, and his clothing carried traces of the same accelerant found at the scene. The forensic evidence now linked the former roommate to the crime in a way that left little room for doubt. With this revelation, the investigation shifted into high gear. The police had their suspect. They could now confidently connect the dots between the evidence at the scene and the individual responsible for Rico's death. The former roommate, whose life had been marked by emotional volatility and a pattern of control, was now the prime suspect in a murder case that would send shockwaves through the community. For Rico's family, the revelation brought a sense of tragic clarity. The man who had once been trusted in their home, the person Rico had lived with, had turned out to be his worst enemy. The betrayal was deep, and the realization that the person responsible for his death was someone so close to him made the loss all the more painful. As the investigation closed in on the suspect, the details of the crime painted a harrowing picture of a carefully orchestrated act of violence. The fire was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of revenge, staged with expert precision to cover up the true nature of the crime. With the suspect's identity now known, the investigation was entering its final phase, where justice would be pursued. But for those who knew Rico, the revelation was not just a piece of the puzzle. It was a painful reminder of the darkness that can sometimes lie hidden in the most unexpected places.